Hello, thank you to the team at Avanade for having us here. My name is James Eaton-Lee. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for an organization called NetHope. In the past, I have a background in cybersecurity in the private sector. I was a security consultant for about 10 years, but for the last 5 or 6 years, I've had roles in the nonprofit sector. I ran the cybersecurity and data protection team at Oxfam, which is a global nonprofit for several years. Worked for a tech startup in the space. But at NetHope, I'm a member-facing chief security officer. My role is largely external. NetHope, for anyone that's not familiar with it, is a US 501c3. We're a nonprofit, but we're a member-based nonprofit. Our members consist of roughly 65 of mostly the largest development, humanitarian, and conservation actors. We're about 20 years old, and almost all of our work focuses on tech, the impact of tech on our nonprofits' work to help them increase their impact, the opportunities that it presents, but also the risks when we don't get it right. Between them, our nonprofits service about 1.2 billion people, and they account for about 60% of all non-governmental aid. I said my role at NetHope is primarily member-facing. I lead on something which we call the Digital Protection Program. Our Digital Protection Program recognizes that today, cybersecurity, privacy, data ethics failures are potentially existential issues for nonprofits. 5-10 years ago, perhaps we thought of these as IT problems, but really today they're things that have to be approached quite strategically. And the slide that's on the screen gives you a sense how we think about these issues within NetHope. We know that the consequences don't just include regulatory risk, financial cost. They also include some quite deep challenges with fundraising, with trust, but also very real harms that humanitarian development and other sorts of nonprofits can cause if they get digital wrong. This also gives you a clue as to why at NetHope we don't have a cybersecurity program, we have a digital protection program. Any of you who are listening who come from the humanitarian space or that's where you have experience will know that protection in the work of an NGO seeks to mitigate and understand the sort of more physical impact of failures of NGO programming on individuals. So, understanding physical safety, thinking about risks of PSCA or safeguarding. And for us, digital protection is a very mindful choice because it conveys how we feel these issues should be understood, whether you're thinking cybersecurity or data protection or data ethics or a little bit more broadly. They're really digital aspects of ways that we're sort of used to thinking, but in this slightly new landscape that we're presented with in the digital age. Thinking about how we start to make that bridge. Sometimes when I talk to nonprofits, I say that cybersecurity is very similar to architecture or automotive engineering. It's a complex problem. I say for anyone who's not familiar with the distinction between complex and complicated, not just because it has many moving parts, but in particular because it's something that's difficult to predict. It's a dynamic and quite adaptive thing. I'll come back to some of the reasons for that in a minute. But like architecture or like automotive engineering, it's something that requires intention and structure to respond to. So the types of consequences we saw on the previous slide, from sort of regulatory to trust, we know we can only avoid those issues if we think about how we embed in our organizations, in our technology stacks, and in our culture, a set of safeguards that are designed to bring about a particular outcome. You wouldn't get in a building, you wouldn't jump in a car that hadn't been engineered, that hadn't been crash tested. Cybersecurity is the same. And, very simple. We can end on this slide if you like, but down the left-hand side of the slide, and of course it's more complicated than this, some of the things we know we need to start doing as an NGO in order to ensure that we have a robust cybersecurity program. So do we have the right leadership, the right people in charge? Are we empowering them with the right knowledge of what they're defending? Do they understand what digital assets, what program areas, what people we have that might be targeted? Can we build the right technical safeguards into those, and have we made the right technology choices that allow us to do that? Do we have the right people culture, knowing that human decision making is at the root of many cybersecurity breaches, whether that's clicking on an email or not being thoughtful when procuring a cloud system, or maybe punching a credit card in online to buy a new digital tool. When things fail, do we have the right teams? Do we have the right tools and technologies to detect that they failed, to understand that somebody's account has been logged into, or something has been integrated in a way that it shouldn't, or a file has been downloaded? And then thinking about continuously tailoring the way that we do that to the kind of organization we are. So some areas of our work might require a lot more rigor, where we're working with payment card data or where we're working with vulnerable people in a conflict setting. And then, of course, understanding and communicating that we deliver value for money, but also that what we're doing is right for the organization, is delivered in a well-governed way. We can already start to see, even if you're not a cybersecurity specialist, why this is. There are many moving parts within the cybersecurity programs in NGOs. And of course, the bottom two bullets on the slide, doing it defensively, ensuring that we can demonstrate when things do go wrong, that we were thoughtful about the way we approach the problem. Suddenly the comparison with architecture maybe starts to seem familiar, and any cybersecurity people on the call will immediately recognize on the right-hand side of the slide the NIST cybersecurity framework. So the US government framework, which has these 5 quadrants and represent another way of thinking about this problem, of being intentional at the beginning, of identifying what it is you want to defend against, of protecting your systems, and then of recovering, detecting breaches in your systems and recovering from any damage that might have been caused. So already we get a sense of why this is a difficult problem to solve. And picking up on some of the themes in the introduction, is if that wasn't bad enough, we know that this is a very different game to 5 or 10 years ago, in particular because of this A word at the top of the slide. Cybersecurity differs from architecture or automotive engineering in that there are people trying to make your building fall down. There are people trying to ensure that your car comes off the road. Cybersecurity fundamentally is an adversarial problem. It's adversarial because breaches in systems aren't an accident, they're not a coincidence. The fact notwithstanding that, of course, if you mismanage your systems, you might inadvertently produce a breach. Or thinking more about data ethics or data protection problems, you might use data in a way that causes harm yourself. But when we're talking about cybersecurity, we're mostly thinking about other humans or other groups of humans who have organized in such a way as to cause our data and cause our systems to be used in ways that we don't want. Fundamentally, cybersecurity is about negating that. Unfortunately, today, this adversarial nature of cybersecurity is no longer curious teenagers or whatever kind of Hollywood metaphor you might want to use. It's in fact highly commoditized and highly commercial. And that's one of the first things that when we coach NGOs through thinking about their cybersecurity, we try to convey and try to help them to understand. Breaches in systems are monetized. And actually, the marketplace is deep and rich. We're all familiar probably with the wave of ransomware that most organizations have seen in the last few years. But if you've not looked into what ransomware is, you might not know, for example, that a lot of ransomware, the tools that are produced to allow data on your systems to be locked are produced by one actor who then sells them to another actor, who may also buy access to your systems in order to use those tools, in order to extort money from you. There's a huge and broad marketplace for everything from tools to initial access. Essentially, if it's profitable to do something, somebody probably will. That's different compared to 10, 15 years ago. It's different even compared to 3 or 4 years ago. Secondly, we're increasingly seeing that attacks against NGOs are politically sponsored. And actually, ransomware is an example of this. There are various governments who, if you read public coverage, there's a strong link that's been drawn between criminal activity in various states who indirectly sponsor particular kinds of breaches. But actually, we can go a step beyond that and observe that many breaches in NGO systems are directly politically motivated. One of the stories that's currently relatively high up in the news cycle on the right-hand side, a tool made by a company called NSO Group called Pegasus, which is essentially a targeted surveillance tool designed to access the mobile phones of individuals in order to extract data or contact lists. And we know widely used across the world, including to target lawyers, journalists, NGO workers, human rights defenders. This represents the commercial marketplace for tools that in many instances are not used in ways perhaps that were even intended by the companies that sold them, but certainly not that we might consider to be desirable or moral or lawful. We know, in fact, that in any context where NGOs operate, where there is any kind of conflict, any kind of dispute over power, these sorts of tools are increasingly used to target NGOs. And one of the most recent pieces of coverage, you can see the Guardian article on the right-hand side, relates directly to an active conflict zone where we know that these tools have been used. And whether you're thinking, Syria, whether you're thinking South Sudan, any sort of humanitarian or development context in which NGOs move, where power is an issue or conflict is an issue, we know that this kind of activity is undertaken by state and non-state actors. They will procure tools in order to get access to NGOs' phones, to understand what they're doing, to get access to their desktops, potentially to disrupt what they're doing. The last point I'm going to make about the way in which cybersecurity has changed in the last few years is that it's heavily automated. if you'd been talking about cybersecurity in a boardroom 5 years ago, you might have said something like, really what we need to do is make ourselves an unappealing target. And it wouldn't have been a horrendous way to approach cybersecurity, a little bit like the way you might think about your house, that actually your goal is to make your house unappealing to break into, putting big bars on the windows and a big sign that says cameras, a big lock, so that somebody goes further down the street. Unfortunately, as well as the political motive, as well as this large sort of criminal and commercial marketplace, one of the other things that is changing is that attacks against systems are heavily automated. It used to be the case that if I wasn't interested in your house, I'd go down the street and I'd jiggle the next door. Today, I can jiggle every door handle on the street to see which ones are unlocked almost instantly. Before we even start thinking about tools like machine learning, the level of automation that's possible with modern cloud systems is enormous. If it's out there on the internet, if it's unprotected, somebody will find it. So this better than our peers approach, it really doesn't work. Cybersecurity today is a problem that everybody has to win collectively. And yet, in spite of the media coverage and in spite of this sort of what you might view as common knowledge broadly within the cybersecurity industry, we know it remains a large problem. Last year, we ran a survey across our members. We're due to publish the report in the next couple of weeks on the state of cybersecurity and humanitarian and development actors. We know from our data that about 2/3 of our members tell us that they don't have confidence in the cybersecurity program that they're running. We know from the data that we have, in which we ask members about their governance structures, the breaches that they've experienced, how they manage cybersecurity, that only about 1/3, in fact, have a senior cybersecurity specialist in charge of some kind of program. And by that, I mean a director or a chief security officer or something similar. Now, if you go to the private sector, it would be unusual at this point in time not to have a post holder like that. We'll get onto the reasons in a moment. When we think about some of these more sophisticated attacks, whether it's sort of ransomware at the lower end or something a little bit more advanced, the tools that we use to detect those kinds of attacks, things like endpoint detection and response or next generation antivirus, sophisticated data-driven tools, which allow organizations to see what's happening on their systems and respond as part of that sort of fast detection and response lifecycle. Only around half of large INGOs tell us that they actually have the skills to use those tools, even if they have the tools themselves. Meanwhile, our partners at Microsoft this year reported that NGOs and think tanks from their data are the second most targeted sector outside government. So hopefully the picture is clear. The marketplace is huge, the problem is large. And of course, a lot of the reason for these gaps is the funding model. So very few of our members, if we ask them directly, I suspect would tell us that they didn't want a senior cybersecurity specialist employed, but 67% of them do tell us that their cybersecurity budget is insufficient. And about 1 in 10 actually don't have figures. The cybersecurity budget is blended with the rest of their IT spend. And you get a sense from the bottom of this slide of why. For most NGOs, revenues have increased marginally in the last 5 to 10 years, whilst the damage, but also the cost of cybersecurity have risen enormously. Private sector organizations tend to have tripled, quadrupled their spending on cybersecurity in the last 2 to 3 years. Very few NGOs have been able to. So I want to talk for a minute or two about our work and what we're trying to do to respond to this problem. I mentioned on one of the first slides that we have something called a digital protection program. The Digital Protection Program at NetHope is essentially a capacity building program for our member NGOs. And what we're trying to do through it is provide them with immediate short-term support to help them with cybersecurity problems, but also, as you might have guessed based on my slide on funding, to start to try to think about more systemic change, which allows NGOs to be able to build better cybersecurity programs. We kickstarted our digital protection program in July of last year. The very first thing we started to offer for those sort of 70% of NetHope members that don't have a chief security officer was that they could access one. So our member organizations, thanks to the kind support of our sponsors and donors, and you can see some of our partners and donors at the bottom of the slide, the very first thing we were able to offer was you have a friend that you can phone. And our members have used that in a variety of quite creative ways. We've helped our members build cybersecurity strategies for the first time. We've helped them hire staff. We've helped them with breach response, and that's free for our members. We've worked across about a third of our member base, I think, at this point. Actually, it's slightly more than on the slide currently with this sort of targeted consultancy. But we know that we're not going to solve the problem purely by working into our NGO's sort of management structures. We've also started working on that stat I gave you a slide ago, in which our members told us that they don't have the skills to use the tools. We've started trying to close that gap. With the SANS Institute, we've run a program this year where we've trained 73 people with a quite high-tech foundational cybersecurity skills. In year 2 of our program, which we're going into, we're going to start to move into blue team or cyber defensive skills. And we've also started to try to make talking about cybersecurity a regular part of the way that we do business. So we've started actually trying to talk about the contexts in which we work and some of the threats that we might face as part of a humanitarian response, as well as starting to try and share, where it's appropriate and where we can, data about attacks on NGOs between them to allow them to collectively defend. Thinking about money, we have a grant program, not just to fund NGOs to help kickstart projects which might close the gap a little bit, but also to try and start changing the financial culture around cybersecurity, to start getting NGO cybersecurity staff to think about non-traditional sources of funding for their programs, because there are many funders in this space who are interested in the problem area, and also building higher quality data to allow us to lobby for more, and in particular to lobby for more structured funding. So many people on the call will be familiar with the Center for Internet Security's critical controls. Version 8, which has just come out, has 18 key controls, which are broken down into subcontrols, which, based on their data and based on public knowledge about attacks against organizations, essentially represent a common denominator, which is compatible with frameworks like the PCI DSS framework, like NIST, like ISO 27001, but that is not only data-driven, but that is also quite practical, broken down into implementation groups and tiered for organizations who are looking for a sort of cybersecurity journey as they adopt the framework. Start with the basics, move on to the more advanced things. We adopted the CIS framework in NetHope a few years ago, and we're about to benchmark our member base for the second time to start to try and build really high quality data about the state of NGO cybersecurity programs at the sectoral level, so that we can then, as an ecosystem, understand what to do about it, where to intervene, where the gaps are, what needs funding, what tech we need. And I maybe hinted at this earlier, but we know fundamentally that this is a collective problem. A breach in one NGO, generally speaking, will affect others. We know we can only win if we're able to work together in order to close the gap. So an ISAC is a pattern in industry, a space in which an industry will come together in order to collectively defend. We're trying to build one for the humanitarian sector. So I'm going to wrap up and hand over to the Avanade team in a second, but just a few takeaways to leave you with. Firstly, cybersecurity is not a technology problem. If your organization doesn't already have a conversation at organizational level, if you're not talking to your board about this, if you're not integrating it into your strategy, you should be. This is a problem. And secondly, in the work that you do on cybersecurity, don't just think about the tech. I've hinted at this already, that the CIS controls are a great place to start, but there are many of these sorts of frameworks. Think about the way you govern your cybersecurity program. Think about the way you report to your board. Think about the structure. If you don't get these things right, you're probably not going to end up with a cybersecurity program that works for you. The point I made before about automation, better than the rest, doesn't work anymore. Your strategy needs to reflect this, and ideally it should align with your program work. If you're not yet at the level where you can do a really thorough risk assessment and understand every space in which you might be exposed to a hostile criminal or state attacker, using something that has a maturity model or implementation groups like the CIS framework that moves from basic to more advanced is a nice way of doing this. But in a maturing or a mature cybersecurity program, you should be thinking about your business areas. Ideally, your cybersecurity senior leader should be engaging with different business areas to understand how your program might need to flex to support them. And then lastly, the point I made about funding and about togetherness. For those of us who sub-grant, for those of us who are funders, thinking about the way we integrate cybersecurity into our funding, where we're doing digital interventions, how we ask for the right cost, where we're funding digital work, how we ensure that it's supported to be safe, but also how, as an ecosystem, we convene together in order to make those changes and collaborate. These are the only ways that we're going to solve the problem long term. And hopefully, if you're not already working with us on that problem, after this call, you'll come and work with us on it. With that, I'll hand back to the Avanade team. Thank you.